Well, I mean, you're talking a matter of degrees of awful to just a little less awful. I mean, this whole idea of the federal government saying we will pick what is a good or bad innovation is really kind of top-down, almost Soviet industrial policy, where we say some experts can get together and tell you what works. And we can look at economic history, we can even look at education abroad where there's much more school choice and see that the key to good education is not trying to have a puppet master decide what works, what doesn't work, what's good, what's bad. As we've been talking about, what you really need is to empower the parents and the communities to control their own schools.
But
and
in these cases, when you look at I3,
ideas.
they want to first see proven success, measured, demonstrable success before they say this is an innovation that works. They're not picking winners, they're identifying winners from places that are trying new things.
Well, actually, they are picking winners. I mean, think about it, to go back to an old cliche, people said the Wright brothers were crazy. The federal government would have gone in and say, well, let's give the Wright brothers some money. They wouldn't have done it, at least under this program, until the Wright brothers had actually achieved flight. So it's wrong-headed to say that, well, the federal government will put the thumb on the scale for innovators who we think work, especially based on if they've already produced a product that works. What people need is that investment before they have something where they can prove it works, and let lots of ideas compete. When the federal government funds something, there goes competition. Then you just have experts saying, well, we've concluded that this is what works, and we can look at countries that have had expert control of lots of things for decades of evidence to see that that doesn't work. You've got to have bottom-up control. And in education, what we don't do, except now we're starting to do it with charter schools, is give power to the people that are supposed to be served by this system, the parents, and then let schools compete, let new ideas be tried. That then spurs competition, which spurs innovation, which we haven't had in education essentially at all for hundreds of years, whereas our computers change, it seems, every day. And so we're doing totally the wrong thing when we say the federal government will be in charge of picking what works, what doesn't work, and what everyone will get.
Gutierrez.
Oh my goodness, that's a total misrepresentation of education in the United States. I don't know where you live. 87% of school funding in Maryland is local. It's paid by property taxes. It's local. It's run by a school board. There is a State Department of Education that also contributes state money. But that ends up being 5 to 7%. The total federal investment is minuscule. It's 5%. 7%. In some states that have higher poverty levels, it's higher. Why? Because the federal government started funding education to address poverty, because the states weren't doing it, because the local school districts weren't doing it. And it carved out, it said, Title I, which is the initial investment from the federal government, said, we need to make sure that poor kids are not being left out. So let's make sure that we have it straight, that when we paint the education problems, we are in problems because states have not done what they needed to do, and because this huge differences from one very rich district to another is just not fair and just. So you spend huge amount of money on one school district because they're wealthy, and not on others. That is where I think we absolutely need to recognize what the federal government is trying to do. This huge infusion of funding is a pittance compared to what is out there already at the state and local level. But it is trying to make significant change. We may quarrel, and I do quarrel, with how they're going about it, how they're targeting, but there's no doubt that the basic thrust of what the federal government is saying is, one, we need to have much clearer transparency of what is happening, what kids are making it, what kids are not, and let's focus and help those kids that are not. The kids that are not are our Latino kids.
Well, I mean, that's how it's presented, right? That the federal government is coming in and they're going to equalize things. But first of all, let's look at that money, which is very important. It is, the federal percentage is small. But the dictates that come with that money are huge. Look at No Child Left Behind. It told every state and every district, you will have standards, you will have tests. Every year you have to make a certain amount of progress. And we will punish you if you don't. And that was based on a small amount of money.
Federal money.
And it's very hard for someone in the state or district to say, I will turn down what look like big chunks of money when you just look at the amount that came from our taxpayers to begin with. And so that's why you almost never see anybody turn down money.
You can't take the money and not make the necessary reforms.
But wait, let me just...
You can't let the states just say, we're going to continue doing what we're doing, and it's okay if we have these huge gaps.
Well, let me just address the transparency part that you brought up, which I think is absolutely essential. So under No Child Left Behind, you said everyone will be proficient by 2014. You'll make adequate progress to that. But of course, what happened was the states simply lowered standards, gutted accountability, or did all sorts of things to game the system where we were telling parents, your child is proficient, but not proficient in any meaningful way. And so if you look at what's called proficiency in every state, it's almost, except for Massachusetts, almost always way below what the National Assessment of Educational Progress said. There is no accountability because there's no transparency.
All of a sudden parents had to know how their kid was doing. You didn't have that before because schools didn't want to reveal that there were these gaps, that some kids were making it, that some schools were better. Now you have a disaggregated data system that has been transformational in education. We need to know, and we Latinos need to know, how our kids are doing. Without that data, we're back to that wonderland that you're describing, is the local control, where there's no real transparency and honesty in saying who graduates, how many kids are dropping out. I can tell you that because I served 8 years on a school board in which I fought to have that information out, and it just was not in the interest of those that didn't want to have that information out. And the parents lost, the kids lost.
Just 2 quick points. You don't have that transparency under No Child Left Behind, and that's the point. Is essentially you're being told your child is proficient under a definition that in no way identifies proficiency. And I'm not calling for local control, I'm not calling for state control, because ultimately the parents and the kids that they are protecting, the people they're supposed to serve, don't have any power because they don't have the money. And so we've seen really no better outcomes, whether we've had district, state, or federal control. And you pay the taxes, but you're not the one who says where that money goes. Then you have to go through multiple political processes that bring in lobby, special interests, and the parents are no longer even really a force in that. The only way to get real transparency, real accountability, and competition that leads to innovation is you've got to give parents that money, let them choose the best schools for their kids.